Well, here we are up to the second college football, episode 12. We do it for the Saturdays. This show is presented by Academy Sports and Outdoors, and they want to remind you to have fun out there with Academy Sports and Outdoors. And what a great show we have planned for you today. Josh Pate, 24/7 Sports, CBS HQ. The guy's great. Was at Carousel a couple weeks back. He's going to head out to that Ohio State, Michigan State game. We have him on the show breaking it all down. Plus, we have reports from the SMU Cincinnati game, Ohio State, Michigan State that we talked about, and also Alabama and Arkansas. It's up to the second college football now. All right, guys, let's get right into it with our big guest of the week, Josh Pate. We had him on the show on TexAgs just a couple of days back, actually a week back. Josh Pate, 24/7 Sports, CBS HQ, and, of course, Late Kick Live and on the podcast as well. Josh, thanks for joining us, man.
I appreciate you having me. I got probably pound for pound the most compliments and reaction from coming on with you guys as I do going on radio in my actual hometown of Columbus, Georgia. So I think that's probably a huge compliment for TexAgs. I also think it may mean that Columbus radio is struggling, and it's probably a mixture of both, but I'm happy to be here.
Well, I'll tell you what, man, before I took the job here in July, everybody's telling me, you got to check out what Josh Pate's doing. He's doing great work, and I think we both have a similar background. You did local television for a while, correct?
I did local sports and then elevated to local news, and that's just – look, I don't even have to do hair, obviously, and that's still waking up at 3:30 every morning to talk about triple homicides. And I'd just rather talk about triple reverses, man.
Yeah, man, I don't miss that news grind at all. All right, let's get into one of the big games this weekend, Ohio State, Michigan State. The Big Ten obviously could be on the line here. Just what's your take on how this game could play out?
So I know when this thing probably opened, I think maybe the point spread was a little jarring, and it's around 20, I think, 19 or 20 or so. This is the game I'm going to go to because I think still it's like when Stanford used to play Oregon back in the Chip Kelly days. They had to put the 20 on there because there's a chance Oregon can run it up any given week. But there's also a chance they can lose outright. And it just, even though the spread was that fat, it always felt like there was this very, very fine seesaw kind of effect. And that's kind of how I feel this game is. I'll tell you what really stands out to me, David, is a couple of weeks ago when Ohio State went into Nebraska and they won. They didn't win as impressively as people thought they should, but they won. Ryan Day the whole week was preaching the right sermon, telling them, number one, that's a better team than their 3 and whatever record indicates. But number two, what he was really trying to tell them is, we have not arrived. We've got all the pieces. Like, they got all the fascinating looking 4- and 5-star pieces. They have not clicked. Last week was the first time that they've probably rubber banded themselves into the trajectory of play that you would expect from Ohio State. The big question with the great teams is, do they do it repeatedly? The answer for them is yes. With Ohio State, this is, I think, the game we find out how serious they are as a national championship contender, because this is the kind of game that there's no more time to build. There's no more time to clean this up and fix this and tighten this up. It's mid-November, dude. And for all likelihood, college football playoff trip is on the line for you from here on out. But also, if you lose this game this weekend, like, not only the playoff is in doubt, but the Big Ten's potentially in doubt. What I love last week is they had really good balance. They had really good throw run. They listened to that offensive line get trashed all week, and then they own the line of scrimmage. That's what I'll be interested in. And the one other thing, I don't know how much the nation's been paying attention, but in Columbus, Ohio, they're a little uneasy about C.J. Shroud and his mental toughness and physical toughness, for that matter, passing up some opportunities to run for extra yardage. And this is the kind of game, and that Michigan game is the kind of game, and the Big Ten title game. That's the kind of game where you may not like it, but you got to put your face in the fan a couple of times that maybe you haven't had to so far this year. So just those intangibles, those moments you need to go over the cliff a little bit, I'm really interested to see what that results in for Ohio State. I do like them to win. I don't really have a strong feel. I think Michigan State has enough in them to cover. But, man, if that thing's a one-possession fourth quarter deal, that is game on. That's going to be fun in Columbus.
Could you see CJ and or Kenneth Walker III making it to New York? I mean, depending on what happens here these next 3 weeks?
Well, this is what's really – I don't normally get into the Heisman, but I'm into it right now because of what you just said. One totally correlates to the other. If C.J. Shroud were to lose Saturday, if Ohio State loses, not only is he possibly to probably knocked out of Heisman contention, at least at the forefront of the conversation, but, I mean, I've got to believe if Ohio State loses, it is directly attributed to Kenneth Walker having a big game. which means one supplants the other. And if you look at the odds right now, it's Bryce and it's CJ and then it's Kenneth Walker. And so he's already up there. And that same thing could happen down the road with Bama in the SEC championship game. Like if they beat Georgia, it's probably because of Bryce Young. Well, what if they lose? And then all of a sudden it's because Jordan Davis has some monster game. Or what if Alabama wins with pedestrian quarterback play because Will Anderson has a big day? So there are a lot of these games down the stretch that are going to define conferences and the playoff that also have these key Heisman players, which is the way it's supposed to play out. And you could have bumper car scenarios on both sides of that fence.
So, Josh, today I don't have Cincinnati as one of the 4 best in the country, but I could see where they will be one of the 4 best in the country, depending on what happens with SMU and the University of Houston there in that conference championship game. Your thoughts on these challenges ahead for Cincinnati and what it means long-term for them this year?
I keep thinking they're going to lose a game because they're not playing dominant football. But you ever notice, I don't know if this happens to you, but it happens to me. You make these statements, well, down the road, down the road, down the road. And then you get further down the road and you realize there's not a lot of road left. Right. I mean, we're in the middle of November. And so they've only got a couple of hurdles left to clear. And then, of course, the AAC title game. What I'm wondering is really how much has changed. Because in years past, what we have said about that requisite G5 this year at Cincinnati is, yeah, they're undefeated. They're going to need some help. And for all the consternation back and forth, it's really the same place we're at right now. And I don't think it's necessarily all of them. Yes, they could have helped themselves by being more dominant. To me, the biggest takeaway here is their conference has dropped the ball for them. I mean, when I was in the preseason and I made a statement like, if Cincinnati goes undefeated, this is the year a G5 will be able to be in the playoff. I said that, predicating it off the idea that their conference was going to have a good enough profile about itself. And it hasn't. And then they also haven't played dominant football. So I look at it right now, and I wonder when we get to that conference championship Saturday and we know what the table looks like, is there going to be a path at all where Cincinnati controls their fate based on their performance that Saturday? As of this moment, it's not impossible. It's kind of tough for me to envision. But then again, you know, as much road as we don't have left, there are still some big bumps on the road for these other contending teams.
Josh, are you intrigued at all by this Arkansas-Alabama game? Because Alabama, obviously, they didn't have a tough game this past weekend, but they seem to have kind of fixed some issues. Arkansas, a team that had a tight one with LSU. Alabama also had a tight one with LSU. Just how do you see that one playing out?
Yeah, I'm intrigued by it. I'm intrigued by every game Alabama plays the remainder of the season. I know they want to believe they have fixed some of those issues. I don't know that they have. They got to the point last weekend, David. Now, granted, they had New Mexico State in town, but they got to the point last weekend where it was so clear after that LSU game that Nick Saban and Bill O'Brien and that offensive brain trust realized, I don't know necessarily, well, in fact, I do know we will not achieve our goals with the current way that we're running this offense. We got a lot of talented kids at wide receiver that we don't think are ready yet, but we're going to have to put them on the field anyway. And so you saw him try and do what you normally don't see Alabama do, and that is force feed some guys that in any other year they probably wouldn't deem ready. They are perilously thin at running back right now. This is why you can never recruit enough running back talent. They had so much running back talent in preseason. Keelan Robinson left and went to Texas. Keelan Robinson was a phenomenal player out of high school, missed last year because of COVID, but trained the whole year. He was going to be a very good player for them. The situation was it was just so loaded. He went to Texas to try and get playing time. They are now repping linebackers and receivers at running back. That's how thin they are right there. One more injury, and they are in massive trouble there. So I say all that, and then you look at the Arkansas factor, and the line on that game is also 20.5. And it's kind of the same feel. It's LSU was 28.5, but yet once you got a little ways into the game, you realize Bama does not have the pull away ability in this thing. And so it's a 4-quarter game. And if they are to make a run, if they are to be able to beat Georgia, to maybe win a championship, the time's up. This now and moving forward against Auburn and then in Atlanta, that's where you have to see it. So if we don't see it Saturday, I just don't think we're going to see it.
Josh, so we were at the Ole Miss game, obviously A&M versus Ole Miss, and it's funny some of the chatter that's come since then. Jimbo yesterday or emphatic that he wasn't going to take the LSU job. Lane Kiffin is a name that has come up as a potential landing spot for LSU, and maybe by Lane beating Jimbo made him more of an attractive candidate. You've got obviously Lincoln Riley. There's a lot of names being thrown out there, but when it comes to Ole Miss and the job Lane Kiffin has done, where do you see him coaching next year, and what about the job he has done there at Ole Miss?
I think it's huge. I think people have their mind made up on Lane Kiffin, and you could say that before this season. Everyone's got their mind made up. Here's the thing about it, though. As well as I do, when you ask a normal person on the street corner, Lane Kiffin, give me your thoughts. They don't talk football first. They're going to talk something other than football. And that's fine if that's what matters to you. I think if you're on a search committee or if you're an athletic director, you have to decide if that's the way you think. Because Lane Kiffin hasn't had a whisper of negative pub off the field at Ole Miss yet. Okay. And that's only been a couple of years, but I think we have to give him that. They're about to potentially be a 10-2 team on the field. I think they are a massive overachiever because defensive personnel still is not there. And yet the product has massively improved. I don't think anyone questions what he can do offensively. I was talking to a big time high school coach the other night, and he said, what Lane Kiffin is doing, Heupel and Kiffin, those two, what they're doing with specific intricacies of offense, it's the talk of the high school circuit right now because they're really imaginative, they're creative, they don't stop evolving. The common eye may not see that. They may just see good offense. But I say all that to arrive at this. If I were running a program, if I'm running Pate State over here, and I've got to weigh the risk reward of potentially hiring Lane Kiffin, I've got to balance these two things. Do I want to run the risk of maybe him embarrassing me down the road if I hire him? Or do I want to run the risk of being the embarrassment because I didn't hire him and now he's the one beating us on the field? And with all the uncertainty out there and all the safer, more surefire hires that have gone off the rails recently, David, I'm not so sure I wouldn't go after Lane Kiffin. I'm not so sure that I wouldn't look at that and say, maybe the percentage chance that this is a new guy or a guy that's figured things out is greater than, me going after some unknown. So I think he's going to get calls. I think it's going to be dependent a lot on which of these jobs opens up, even in the SEC, which of these jobs opens up. I'm looking specifically at Florida to be clear about that.
Josh, let's talk A&M for a second. This past weekend was not a good weekend for them. They had a chance to win the game, but big picture, to me, they can really turn this season into something if they can win 10 games, considering you had Zach Calzada as your quarterback. When you think about A&M and the direction they're going, regardless of what happened this past weekend, what do you see?
It's the same thing that I was talking about going into the Auburn game, coming out of the Auburn game. It's people. All right, so I don't have a blank piece of paper. I got a pen though. So people expect to look at a program and here's a data point, here's a data point, here's a data point, here's a data point, and it's just linear. The progression is linear. And in reality, it's more like here's a data point, here's a data point, here's a data point, and then you draw the mean and it may be linear, but in any given week, things could look a lot worse than they did last week, which is the exact case you saw in Oxford, Mississippi. That doesn't mean the program's not still improving. It just means you didn't see a 6-day improvement, let's say. That's the way a lot of people are trained to think. The way that you should actually think is the former. I think that what they've got to do this spring and then subsequently this next upcoming season and seasons after that, the explosivity in the passing game is something everyone around A&M wants to see. It's a stat that's too low. It's a stat that has to be better. It's a stat that if you're going to continue to attract the premier wide receiver talent in the country, you've got to be able to show them in terms of a result. And so they've got so much going for them. Everything from an intangible or an external standpoint is there in droves. It's just the product on the field, while improving, still can get better. And if they were to do nothing more, if you could promise me nothing more than, that explosivity in the pass game rate, it's going to raise from being in the 90s, being in the 50s next year and in the 30s, I would feel confident saying, I'll bet they've got a championship coming in the next 3-4 years. I would bet they've got a championship coming. Because to me, that's one of the key indicators. And one of the few remaining that makes me go, A&M, am I ready to endorse that kind of sentence yet? Well, if you removed that problem from the equation, I'd be ready.
Josh, got about a minute left. We're entering a bowl season that perhaps Texas and LSU are both not playing in. Texas' second year of Sark coming up, and LSU will have a first-year coach next year. Just the state of those programs and how big this next few months will be.
They are totally different to me. The Texas program, there is a lot deeper rooted issue there. I know people want to call it culture. I think you have to get a lot more specific than that. I mean, culture is a very, that's like car. It's a very overarching term. Make, model, like specifically with Texas, what are the cultural issues? Is it just roster? Is it just you got some bad apples in that roster barrel? If so, empty the barrel. Start over. No, not start over literally, but recruit over that, transfer portal over that. At LSU, they don't have that. One of the most important things that's been pointed out to me when you look at LSU is, yes, they're losing right now and they're firing their coaching staff. They have had minimal off-field issues. Though that roster they have hadn't been in trouble. You didn't see a mass exodus of guys to the portal. They've got administratively top to bottom everything they need. It is a race car. Everything there is ready. Recruiting has not fallen off. Everything's ready. It's one of the most ready-made winning positions that any major program has ever been in, to put a new coach in position to succeed right away. So I think they're two totally different issues that may just appear similar on the surface because of record.
Josh, great stuff, my friend. Let's do it again.
I appreciate it, man.
At Academy Sports and Outdoors, bikes for the whole family are just a click away. Buy online at academy.com with our free in-store assembly. Your next set of wheels, plus helmets, pads, and water bottles will be waiting for you at our in-store pickup counter. Get to the fun faster with our in-store pickup and free assembly at Academy Sports and Outdoors.
We keep it going here on Up to the Second College Football, our big game showdown. Alabama, Arkansas. Both teams have some tough games there with LSU over the last couple of weeks. And to discuss it, we're joined by Tony Tsoukalas from BamaInsider.com. Tony, what's going on, my friend?
Hey, man. How's it going?
Good, man. So let's talk about this game in particular. If you're Alabama, what concerns you about this Arkansas matchup?
Well, I don't know if they're going to have too much trouble. I think Alabama, you're concerned about that offensive line. And I don't know if Arkansas in particular, but this offensive line for Alabama has been a total mess. And, you've got some big games coming up. They're all big from here on out. And if you can't, establish a good, core five, or if you can't figure that out over the next few weeks, it's going to be real trouble with doing what they want to do this season. And so that starts with Arkansas for me. So for me, it's getting the run game going. They just lost Roydell Williams. They're only down to 2 scholarship running backs, and Brian Robinson and Trey Sanders. Granted, that's a pretty good 2, but so I think Arkansas, if they can stop the run and make Alabama one-dimensional, that's what I would be concerned about from an Alabama perspective heading into this matchup, and really just kind of proving that you can still run the ball with all the, knocks you've taken at that aspect of the game.
Yeah, I want to talk about that because you got linebackers trying to be a running back. I mean, it's just talk about how thin that position is and what it could mean long-term.
I mean, if you would have told me that depth was going to be a concern at the running back position for Alabama at the beginning of the season, I would have called you crazy, because they had 5 guys that were all 4-star and above, but they've had 3 separate injuries at that position. And now you're down to, the starter and Brian Robinson, a 5-star guy in Trey Sanders, but a guy that's also coming off of 2 straight season-ending injuries. So he's a guy that, you have to consider a little bit fragile. And then, back number 3 is probably Christian Leary, who's a freshman, slot receiver that they've kind of moved into a running back role. And then back number 4 at the moment is Demoy Kennedy, who's a former 5-star linebacker who played a little bit of running back in high school. Both Leary and Kennedy played some back in high school, but I mean, that's not where you want to be when you're going into the SEC, into the stretch run of your SEC game. You don't want to be handing it off to a receiver or a linebacker. We'll see how they do, and those are 2 talented guys. But ideally, Alabama would have had more depth at running back. It's just that's the way the injuries shook out.
Tony, do you think that Bryce Young is still the leader when it comes to the Heisman race, or is Matt Corral potentially getting back into it? Kenneth Walker with a big game this weekend. How do you see that, where it is today, and how it's going to shake out?
Yeah, I actually think you didn't mention him, but C.J. Shroud would be the guy that I think is going to make a big move. I expect Ohio State to win this week. This will be a big time for him. And the way you talk about Arkansas too, they're kind of like Ole Miss where they do that drop 8 defense. And I think that that's going to lead to an efficient game from Bryce Young, but maybe not like the big play game from Bryce Young. So I wouldn't be surprised if Bryce gives up temporarily his front runner role to, you said, either Kenneth Walker or C.J. Shroud. Whoever wins that matchup, I could see them jumping ahead this week, people getting really high on them. But I think Bryce Young's in it. He's definitely the favorite, so far. And I think really what it comes down to for Bryce is if he can keep Alabama, if he can just keep on what he's doing, and then it's going to come down to that Georgia matchup in the SEC championship game. He can pull together a good performance there and possibly, lead Alabama to a victory. I think you can just write his name on the Heisman because, I think you look at this Georgia defense and this Georgia team in general, and they're so much better than everyone else. If Bryce Young can lead Alabama to a victory there the week before the Heisman comes out, I think you have to give it to him. So that's his biggest test. As long as he stays, among the top 2 or the top 3 and then performs well in that Georgia game, I think he's in really good shape to get the award.
What about his partnership with Jamison Williams, how they've really developed a great chemistry?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. He's been the big time threat. I think he's averaging something like 17 yards a reception, or at least 17 yards in the ball's traveling through the air on passes to him. He's just the home run guy. It's funny. John Mechie has been kind of the shallow guy. And they've been doing a lot of throws, like little bubble screens or smaller passes to him. And then you've been hitting the home runs with Jamison Williams. It's somebody kind of said it. It's kind of like the Thunder Lightning version, except for in wide receivers instead of running backs. But that's kind of a good combination for Alabama. Obviously, Bryce is, kind of bonded well with Jamison Williams, and they're clicking. And it seems like if you throw the ball up to him, 5 times a game, he's going to come up with 2, 30+ yard receptions. So, just lobbing it deep and letting him beat his defender. It sounds pretty basic, but that's been working for Alabama. Not many people can catch up with Jamison Williams, just with the speed he brings at the position. So it's a dangerous option, and Alabama's going to need it too. We talked about the running game. I think you're going to need to lean a little bit more on the passing attack moving forward.
All right, so let me ask you this, what I think is an easy answer, but maybe it's not when it comes to Alabama. Can they lose at all this year? Georgia, Arkansas, Auburn. Is there any way they can have another loss and still make it to the college football playoffs this year, in your opinion?
It's kind of crazy, but I think that as long as they make it to the SEC championship game and beat Georgia, I think they can have 2 losses, which sounds kind of insane. But if they were to lose one of these 2 games, and now if they get blown out, I think it's different. But like I said, the win against Georgia, I think would do it for them, just because Georgia's been so much better than everyone else. And if Alabama, are you really going to take out the SEC champion after they just beat the number 1 team, especially when it's a brand name like Alabama? I know it's going to upset some people, but I think that it could happen. The thing I don't see necessarily is if Alabama wins against Arkansas and Auburn and then loses close to Georgia, I'm not sure that they take a 2-loss Alabama that doesn't have that conference championship or the conference title. So I think it's possible that could still happen, but I think that they have to have one of the 2, either 1 loss or either the SEC championship game or just 1 loss. It kind of depends on how things shake out around it, but I think I almost want to see that happen, just to see if a 2-loss Alabama SEC champion would make the playoffs. I would assume it would, and I would assume it caused a ton of drama in college football.
We appreciate you, Tony. Thanks so much, man.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me on.
Need a new grill? Academy Sports and Outdoors is the destination for your outdoor cooking needs. With our free in-store assembly and pre-assembled grills and smokers, buy online at academy.com and pick up in-store. So keep those grilling plans at Academy Sports and Outdoors.
All right, can Cincinnati's dream season continue? They got a tough game this weekend with SMU, and of course, University of Houston is still looming out there. To discuss it, we're joined by Justin Williams, who covers the Bearkats for The Athletic. Justin, thanks for joining us, man.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So, in your opinion, and you're close to the program, is Cincinnati one of the 4 best teams in the country right now?
I guess it depends on what you go by, right? If you're looking at win-loss record, then yeah, there's only 3 undefeated teams, and UTSA, okay, that's a separate thing. But Cincinnati has a top 10, win against Notre Dame on the road. they play in what I think everyone considers, the toughest non-P5 conference in the AAC. They went on the road and beat Indiana, a Big Ten team, which certainly hasn't had the year that Cincinnati hoped they would have to help them with the rankings. But, they've kind of done everything that's been asked of them. And I guess, the question, are they one of the top 4 teams right now? I'm not sure. But I think they hope that if they can take care of business and win out this season, and then, maybe continue some of these other teams that have to play tough opponents and might suffer some losses, I think they kind of hope and feel that they'll be one of the top 4 when the season ends and it comes time to make those final playoff rankings.
Is it fair that people do the argument, well, if Cincinnati played in the SEC, well, if they played Georgia, this and that, is that a fair argument for where we are right now, considering that they are in a Group of 5 conference?
I don't know if it's a fair argument this year, just because, you look at a team like Oregon, who, they went on the road and beat Ohio State, but they lost to a 3-5 Stanford team. I mean, Cincinnati's played a lot of teams in the AAC that are better than Stanford. And you could make that case, you could look at Alabama's resume or Michigan's resume, and it's not like they have super impressive resumes, even if they're playing against Power 5 conference teams in conference every week. So I think this year, especially knowing what Cincinnati was able to do going on the road and beating Notre Dame, you could argue the only teams that have a better win than that are Oregon and Texas A&M beating Alabama, and Cincinnati's the only one out of those who are undefeated. And so if you kind of go by that metric, then I think this year it's hard to make that argument. You certainly can, and people certainly will. And look, Cincinnati knows that, because that's the reason they're going to the Big 12 in a couple of years, because that's what's been, levied against them the past few years. But I think, the other argument you could make is Cincinnati played Georgia in the Peach Bowl last year. They should have won. They kind of blew it at the end, but they're obviously right there with them. And, the other argument is give them a chance, in the playoff against those teams. We've seen really good Power 5 teams get blown out in the playoff. Give the Bearcats a chance to get blown out and maybe prove otherwise in that playoff. That's certainly the way they feel.
How tough of a challenge is SMU going to be for the Bearcats?
Really big, and honestly, a much tougher challenge than I think people expected just a couple weeks ago, because Cincinnati's defense has had a couple down weeks. They gave up almost 300 rushing yards to Tulsa a couple weeks ago. SMU's not a big passing or rushing team, but just last week, Cincinnati gave up like over 200 yards passing in the second half against USF. And SMU can, they can sling it around, and they're certainly a better team than USF. So I think we're starting to see some of the attrition and grind of the season, both in terms of on the field, but also all the off-field attention and expectations. It seems like it's wearing a little bit on Cincinnati. So a couple weeks ago when SMU was, they dropped a game, they lost to Houston, and they dropped another one after that. Maybe the thought was this wouldn't be as big of a game as initially thought coming into it. But now with, I think, Cincinnati may be limping a little bit. This will be a tough test the way SMU can come in and throw the ball around.
Justin, I find Desmond Ridder to be such I don't want to say he's not polarizing, but I feel like people who cut for him, they really love him. And then there's another group that just kind of discounts him, almost like Cincinnati as a program. Is that a fair assessment?
I think when you're talking about maybe his, professional prospects, you see that, people say, can he be a first-round draft pick because he's not accurate enough, or something like that. I think if you're just looking at body of work as a college quarterback, this guy is going to go down as one of the top 5 winningest quarterbacks in college football history. He just passed Peyton Manning this week for 40 career wins. He just broke Cincinnati's all-time passing touchdown record this past week. So if you're just kind of looking at it from that standpoint, he's certainly not perfect, but man, college quarterback, he's going to go down as one of the best. And I think he has a chance, if he finishes the year well, to maybe go to New York and at least be in that kind of Heisman finalist conversation. But I do think, so much of it now is tied into, all right, what are they going to project as? And I think that's where maybe some of the polarization comes in with Desmond Ridder, is you're looking at what he's going to be like as an NFL quarterback and maybe not fully appreciating how good he is as a college quarterback.
How important are style points going to be to Luke Fickell, knowing that, yes, you could be undefeated and still not get in, unfortunately. But if you do take down SMU by a considerable amount, and the University of Houston, who has had a very nice season as well, how that could change the narrative?
Yeah, style points it's kind of become a dirty phrase around here in Cincinnati. The team hates to hear it. The fans are kind of getting sick of it because that's what's been levied against them. I honestly don't know how much it matters. If Cincinnati was in a situation where they're 10-0, but they've beaten all these teams by 30 points instead of winning a couple games close, would they get more respect from the committee? I don't know. Based on where the committee put them that first time at number 6, it almost seems like they were always going to need help from these other teams, meaning they're going to need these other teams to lose around them to get them into the playoffs. So maybe the national broader discourse about Cincinnati would be a little bit more, fervent or supportive if they were blowing out these teams. But I have a hard time believing that if they would have beat Navy by 30 instead of 7, that would be what, gave the committee reason to put them in at 4 instead of 6 or something like that. That just doesn't seem like, a likely reason based on everything they've said. So it certainly helps their cause if they can get those style points and, get a little bit more momentum at their back. But at this point, I think they need to go undefeated, and they need some of these, Big Ten teams, SEC teams around them to lose and kind of create that path for them.
All right, Justin, last thing for you. How does this all going to play out these next 3 weeks?
So, this is a big one for Cincinnati. I think if you're going from the perspective, and it's certainly not outlandish, that Cincinnati takes care of business and they went out, then you need Oregon to lose. You probably need Ohio State to run the table and kind of knock Michigan State and Michigan out of there, which, will create some weird cognitive dissonance for both Ohio State and Cincinnati fans. You need Notre Dame to keep winning. And then you probably need Alabama to lose to Georgia in the SEC championship game convincingly, honestly, because I don't think there's a lot of people that feel confident a 2-loss Alabama team might not get the benefit of the doubt. So, but there is a path there if some of those teams fall off, if the Big 12 teams keep eating each other and Cincinnati takes care of business. I think there's a chance where they could kind of sneak into that 4th seed and maybe get a rematch against Georgia. From a Cincinnati perspective, they know, like, if they slip up at all, they're out of the conversation. So, if you ask them about it, they're kind of tunnel vision. Hey, we have a big game against SMU, then we have to make sure we get the home conference championship game and kind of win out. But if they can do that, I certainly think there's a not outlandish path for them to get into the top 4.
I lied to you. I think I do want to follow it up with a question and how the bowl game last year, the Peach Bowl, how that set the tone for this year. Cincinnati was leading against this year's best team in the country, 21-10, I think it was. It was a nice lead, and then Georgia ended up winning that game. Regardless of who played, who didn't play in that game for Georgia and for Cincinnati, how did that maybe set them up for success this year?
I think there's 2 things. One is, Luke Fickell just talked about this today, you have to play against the best and compete against the best to, be considered the best. And for them, Georgia's one of the most talented teams in the country. And they went into that game and should have won. And I think for them, it was kind of a boost. Maybe they don't go into Notre Dame this year and win on the road if they didn't have that experience against Georgia. The other kind of interesting thing is it might have been a blessing in disguise because they got some COVID seniors back. Desmond Ridder could have gone to the NFL. He comes back. And I think the bad taste of that Georgia loss to end the year actually kind of convinced some guys to kind of hang around, give it one more shot, and maybe extended their window. So Cincinnati doesn't like to talk about it that way, but losing that Georgia game might have actually set them up for success this year.
All right, Lie 2.0. I have another follow-up. So let's just pretend Cincinnati wins the national championship this year. What is that going to do for Group of 5 moving forward? Or let's just say they make it to the national championship game and they beat an SEC team. They beat one of the top teams, a Big Ten team. Does that kind of change the narrative, you think, moving forward for these Group of 5 schools?
I hope so. And again, it kind of puts Cincinnati in a weird spot because they're all Big 12 focused. That's where they're going to be in a couple of years. But I certainly think you can make the argument that, you have to at least give these Group of 5 teams a shot. Whether that means playing them, that's the other tough thing is these good Power 5 teams don't want to play a team like Cincinnati because they could get beat. They could go into Notre Dame and win games. So you have to be able to schedule them, and then you have to give them a chance to go out and prove themselves against these teams. And it's one of those things where maybe you don't fully get that respect until you see someone do it. And so maybe Cincinnati, even though they're going to the Big 12, can kind of establish, give these Group of 5 teams a chance and let them prove their worth.
All right, very good stuff there. We appreciate it, Justin. Let's do it again, my friend.
Anytime. I appreciate it.
All right, we got another huge one coming up this weekend in the Big Ten. Michigan State and Ohio State's got huge implications for what happens for the playoffs, Big Ten championship, and whatnot. Our buddy Kevin Noon from BuckeyeScoop.com joining the show. Kevin, what's going on, man?
Not much. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you, sir. So a mega matchup this weekend. Just where is Ohio State mentally, physically as they enter this big-time game?
Well, I think that they're ready for the challenge. They knew what the schedule was going to look like down the stretch. They knew that it was backloaded. They knew that there was a chance to have some highly ranked games at the end. And, really there's nowhere to hide at this point. You have to bring your A game every week because the teams out there are going to be highly ranked. Michigan State is 7th. as of this week, and we'll kind of see where things stand from there. But, with that being said, Ohio State also is a 2.5 touchdown favorite. So, maybe that there's a huge gap between your top four and beyond. But Ohio State knows this Michigan State team really well. Michigan State has handed Ohio State some losses over the past decade. So, they're not going to be looking past them at Michigan.
Yeah, so I'm having a hard time understanding the point spread in this one. Not because I don't think Ohio State should be favored, but that seems like a big number for two highly ranked teams.
Yeah, and Ohio State was also almost a 20-point favorite, 21-point favorite against Purdue, and ended up winning that game by 28. And everybody was saying, "Oh, that spread is too large." I didn't pick them to cover last week, and lo and behold, they did. So, I think what part of the issue is that they see a dynamic offense with Michigan State, but they see an even more dynamic offense with Ohio State. Both teams struggle a little bit against defending the pass, and Ohio State has been throwing the ball all over the field. So I just think that they see the chance of this being potentially a game of Ohio State in the 50s and maybe Michigan State in the 30s, and still covering in a game that people will be like, well, maybe Ohio State wasn't all that sharp, even though it put up all these points.
One of the things I know Ryan Day said, I think it was earlier today in the press conference, that these are the type of games you come to Ohio State for, and this is just not the first, but one of many coming up.
Yeah, absolutely. You come to Ohio State to play these November games because you're generally going to end up getting Penn State, Michigan State, and always Michigan as the season finale. These are these types of big games. College game day is going to be there. The eyes of the college football world are going to be on this game. It's a relatively light weekend to begin with, but when you have 4 and 7 playing each other, it's magnified that much more. This is not the Michigan State team that we've seen in the past couple of years that struggled in the transition from Mark D'Antonio to Mel Tucker. Mel Tucker really hit the portal hard, went out, brought some talent in, especially Kenneth Walker III, the running back that he ended up going and getting out of the ACC. I think that this is going to be just one of these Titanic type of games that we're going to be talking about for a long time.
Kevin, this is a fun one, too, because I think we might get a shootout. Do you think this is how this game's going to play out?
I think Michigan State's going to put some points up. I think we saw in the Purdue game when Purdue put up, 30-plus points in that game, people were like, okay, well, this might be what we're going to be facing with Ohio State. I certainly don't think Peyton Thorne is the type of passer that Aiden O'Connell is. While I like the receivers on Michigan State, they don't have a David Bell, in my opinion. I mean, they don't have that guy that just brings it in the big games, but I think they have the run-pass diversity to put some points up. On the other side, Ohio State's offense really is a type of offense that you give them 30, 35 and say, okay, where do you go from there? I really like Ohio State to get into the 50s in this game, and I really wouldn't be surprised to see Michigan State get into the 30s. So I'm still kind of waffling on what my pick is going to be in terms of what the point spread is, but I do think that I don't know what the over-under is, but I would be leaning toward the over.
How do you stop Kenneth Walker?
You've got to sit there and understand that he's a patient back. You can't overcommit. You've got to get him to the ground. Just because you sit there and make contact with him, he does such a great job of picking up yards after contact. You have to be decisive, but in being decisive, you can't sit there and over pursue. I mean, Ohio State can't let its eagerness to be able to get to him to derail their plans on him. You just have to know that he is going to get his, but try and keep those 7-8 yard hits at 7 or 8 yards. Don't go out and make a stupid play and let him run for 45, 50.
Kevin, I look at C.J. Shroud's season, and I know he's one of those guys that is being mentioned as an outsider contender for the Heisman, but this next stretch could really put him there potentially in the driver's seat, depending on how other guys play. But, I mean, that's certainly in that top 3 mix.
Yeah, I mean, who really has had a Heisman moment? I mean, obviously Caleb Williams had one in terms of taking the ball from his running back and running it in, but now Oklahoma's kind of fallen off the table a little bit if you buy into the one game. So, Bryce Young, Matt Corral, C.J. Shroud. I mean, I've seen one book that has C.J. Shroud as the guy right now. And, we haven't seen anybody really have that moment. You're going to have the backdrop of playing Michigan State, Michigan, and then potentially a Big Ten championship game. And we know when most of the ballots come in, they come in at the last minute. So get out there, have one of those moments, and C.J. Shroud could be holding the hardware come the end of the season.
All right, there he is, Kevin Noon. Thanks so much, man.
Absolutely.
Well, how about that show? I liked it. I hope you did as well. I'd like for you to comment, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. It is Up to the Second College Football, presented by Academy Sports and Outdoors. See you guys next week.